It was upon a grey and mist-laden morning in the early November that I was once again roused from my slumber by a firm and urgent knocking upon the door of our quarters at 228 Baker Street. The clock on the mantel had just struck 5:30, and the lamps outside cast a wan, uncertain glow upon the fog that pressed against the glass. I had scarce risen from my bed when I heard the unmistakable tones of Sherlock Holmes, cool and deliberate even at this early hour. "Come in, Lestrade. You will find the fire freshly laid. Watson, pray put on your dressing gown. We have a visitor in some distress." The mention of Inspector Lestrade was sufficient to banish the remnants of sleep from my mind. I hastened into the sitting-room to find the diminutive officer standing by the hearth, his coat glistening with fog and his hat clutched in one hand. Holmes, wrapped in his dressing gown of deep grey, stood before him with that peculiar stillness of countenance that heralded the awakening of his mind to a new puzzle. "You will forgive me for disturbing you at such an hour, Mr. Holmes," said Lestrade, brushing dampness from his sleeves, "but this is no ordinary business. Her Grace, the Duchess of Ravenscourt, has disappeared from her residence during the night." Holmes' eyes flickered with a spark of interest. "Disappeared, you say? And under what circumstances?" "She was last seen retiring to her room at 10 o'clock last evening," replied Lestrade. "This morning, her maid discovered the bed unslept in, the window slightly open, and her jewels, worth a small fortune, missing from the case upon her dressing-table." Holmes lowered himself into his armchair, steepled his fingers, and regarded the inspector with quiet amusement. "And, naturally, you suspect abduction or theft by one of the household staff?" Lestrade nodded briskly. "That, or something worse. The Duke is beside himself. The newspapers will make a feast of this if word escapes the household. The Duchess is a lady of society, and her marriage has been, well, talked about enough as it is." At this, Holmes's brows arched slightly. "Ah, so the marriage was not altogether felicitous?" "Far from it," said Lestrade grimly. "The Duke is 20 years her senior, and a man of, how shall I say, rigid temperament. There are whispers of quarrels, though none have dared speak of them publicly. Still, a lady vanishing from her home in the night. Well, there's scandal enough in that." Holmes rose suddenly and paced to the window, gazing into the swirling fog as though he could divine some truth from its depths. "You said the jewels were missing. Tell me, were they of great sentimental value, or merely monetary?" "Both," said Lestrade. "A wedding gift from the Duke himself, diamonds and sapphires of exceptional cut." Holmes smiled faintly. "Then we have either an abduction with motive, a theft with sentiment, or a flight with purpose. 3 possibilities, each appealing in its own way." I could not help but interject. "Surely, Holmes, you do not suggest that the Duchess has run away?" "Watson," he replied, turning to me with that gleam of mischief which so often preceded his most brilliant deductions, "you will recall that in cases of vanishing women, one must never rule out the simplest of explanations. The heart, my dear friend, is a far greater conspirator than the criminal mind." Lestrade grunted in disapproval. "You'll find no romance in this one, I'm afraid. The Duke insists his wife was perfectly content. She'd no reason to flee. Which makes it all the more probable that she has done precisely that," murmured Holmes. He turned abruptly to the inspector. "You said her window was open. Was it forced?" "No sign of that. It overlooks the gardens. The ground below showed no footprints, though the grass was damp with dew." Holmes smiled again, almost indulgently. "No footprints? Yet a lady, vanishing in silk and slippers, leaves no mark upon wet ground? Curious indeed." He reached for his violin, plucking absently at a string as his gaze drifted toward the ceiling. "Watson, my dear fellow, it appears we must postpone our breakfast. Lestrade, if you would be so good as to summon a cab, we shall accompany you to Ravenscourt House forthwith." The fog clung thick about the streets as we made our way to the Duke's London residence in Belgrave Square. The tall iron gates stood open, and the gas lamps flickered weakly through the damp air. A butler in mourning black received us, his face pale with exhaustion. "This way, gentlemen," he said tremulously. "His Grace is in the drawing-room. He has scarcely spoken since the constable brought word." The Duke of Ravenscourt was a tall, austere man with the thin lips and high nose of a hawk. He rose as we entered, but did not extend his hand. "Mr. Holmes, I'm grateful for your promptness. You must find her. The Duchess, my wife, is not a woman given to foolish impulses. Something dreadful has occurred." "Pray, Your Grace," said Holmes calmly, "permit me a few questions before we proceed upstairs." He seated himself without invitation and regarded the Duke with a steady gaze. "Had your wife, in the past fortnight, received any letters of peculiar nature? Or visitors unannounced?" The Duke hesitated. "She has corresponded with her cousin, Lord Halberton, who is staying at his estate in Kent. As for visitors, only Lady Whitcomb, her dearest friend." "No one else?" Holmes inclined his head. "And you last saw her? When?" "At dinner. We parted cordially. She retired early, claiming a headache." "That was the last?" Holmes's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "Cordially," he repeated. "A rare thing between husband and wife, if the servants are to be believed." The Duke stiffened. "I beg your pardon, sir." But Holmes did not answer. He had risen and was already examining the mantelpiece, the arrangement of ornaments, and the faint impression of a missing photograph upon the velvet-lined wall. After a long silence, he turned to Lestrade. "We shall begin with the Duchess's chambers. Watson, keep your eyes open for what ought to be there, but is not." I confess, I felt the first true thrill of the hunt in that moment. For beneath Holmes's quiet tone, I recognized the unmistakable timbre of fascination. Whatever had happened to the Duchess of Ravenscourt, it was no mere theft, nor a simple flight of fancy. It was, unmistakably, a puzzle worthy of Sherlock Holmes. The Duchess's apartments at Ravenscourt House occupied the eastern wing, overlooking the garden. The morning light, pale and uncertain through the November fog, lent the corridor a ghostly stillness as Holmes, Lestrade, and I followed the butler upstairs. Holmes walked in silence, his eyes darting along the floorboards and up the walls, noting the smallest of details with that hawk-like precision I had come to know so well. When we reached the door to the Duchess's room, he paused a moment and inhaled deeply, as though even the scent of the air could betray the secrets within. "Has anything been disturbed?" he asked. "Nothing, sir," replied the butler. "We locked the room upon discovery and have touched nothing since." Holmes nodded approvingly. "Excellent. It is refreshing to meet a man who understands the value of inaction." The door opened with a soft creak, and we stepped into a chamber that might have belonged to a princess in some melancholy fairy tale. The bed stood neatly made, its white coverlet undisturbed. A small fire smouldered in the grate, and beside it lay a faintly smoking taper that had burned itself to the end. A dressing table near the window glittered with an array of bottles, brushes, and trinkets. But the central case, which no doubt had held the missing jewels, stood open and empty. Holmes advanced into the room with the care of a man stepping through a crime scene constructed of glass. He examined the window, the sill, the carpet, and even the folds of the bedspread. Not a thread escaped his notice. "Watson," he murmured, "observe the bed. What do you make of it?" I looked, somewhat bewildered. It appears she never slept in it. "Precisely. Yet see here. The pillow is slightly indented, not by the head of a woman, but by a hand, a small one, and the coverlet bears the faintest crease, one made by someone leaning forward rather than lying down. It tells us that the Duchess was here for at least a few moments, and that she was composed rather than frightened. Whatever befell her, it did not occur in haste." Lestrade, who had been busy poking at the window latch, snorted. "You can tell all that from a pillow, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes smiled thinly. I can tell even more from your boots, Inspector. You have stepped in the soot near the grate. Pray be cautious, or you will obscure what remains of a rather singular footprint." Lestrade jumped back at once, muttering his apologies. Holmes crouched near the hearth, his sharp eyes fixed upon a faint mark upon the rug. "Small, narrow, and shallow," he said softly. "Not a man's shoe nor a woman's slipper. Something in between, a child's perhaps, or a servant's. Yet the Duchess has no children, and her personal maid wears larger shoes. Curious indeed." He straightened suddenly and crossed to the dressing table. There, he picked up a delicate violet ribbon, faintly scented and frayed at one end. He turned it between his fingers, thoughtfully. "Watson, do you recall the peculiar fashion among certain ladies last season?" I hesitated. "You refer, perhaps, to the wearing of ribbons about the wrist?" "Just so. The Duchess was no stranger to that affectation, according to the society columns. Yet note, the fraying here suggests it was torn, not unfastened. The wearer either struggled or was seized." Lestrade frowned. "So she was taken from the room?" Holmes made no reply. Instead, he bent over the window and examined the latch through his lens. Then, opening it slightly, he leaned out to survey the garden below. The fog was lifting now, revealing a manicured lawn and a gravel path leading toward a side gate. "No marks upon the sill," he said. "No footprints below. A neat vanishing indeed. Unless, of course—" He reached into his pocket, drew out his magnifying glass again, and examined the inner edge of the frame. A faint gleam caught the light. "Ah," he murmured. "Watson, do you see this? A smudge of grease upon the wood, consistent with the oil used in carriage lamps, and a small grain of gravel wedged into the crack of the sill. She did not leave through the garden. She was lifted from without, into something higher than the ground. A carriage window, perhaps." Lestrade's eyes widened. "You mean she was abducted directly from her room?" Holmes smiled faintly. "The simplest answer often hides beneath the most impossible circumstance. Someone brought a carriage to the east side, near the low terrace. The Duchess was drawn to the window, perhaps under pretense or persuasion, and assisted, or compelled, into the vehicle. There was no struggle, hence no noise. Ingenious in its simplicity." He turned suddenly toward the fireplace once more. "And yet why the missing jewels? A lover's flight disguised as theft, or a theft disguised as flight?" For several moments he stood motionless before the fire, lost in thought. Then he spoke softly, almost to himself. "Lestrade, you mentioned a Lady Whitcomb, her Grace's dearest friend. Does she live nearby?" "In Grosvenor Place," Lestrade answered. "A widow of some means." "Then she will do very well for the next step," said Holmes briskly. "Watson, you will accompany me. I should like a word with Lady Whitcomb before the newspapers get wind of this affair. Lestrade, remain here and instruct the Duke that we have found several interesting indications, but require discretion above all else. If the word abduction appears in the morning press, it will drive our quarry into the shadows." As we descended the grand staircase, I could not resist asking, "Holmes, do you truly believe the Duchess has been taken, or that she fled of her own will?" Holmes's eyes glimmered with that strange inward light I had seen only when he was on the scent of something extraordinary. "My dear Watson," he said, "the truth is rarely found in the middle of the road. It prefers the shadowed lanes where love and fear exchange disguises. Until we meet Lady Whitcomb, I shall reserve judgment. But mark my words, this is no ordinary theft. This is a performance, staged with remarkable intelligence." And with that, he hailed a cab. As we drove off into the swirling London mist, I saw him lean back against the seat, eyes closed, lips curved in a faint smile. The game, I knew, was well and truly afoot. Our cab rattled through the damp morning streets toward Grosvenor Place, the fog curling between the wheels like ghostly serpents. Holmes sat motionless beside me, his gloved fingers pressed together beneath his chin, eyes half closed in that curious state between rest and rapture that always heralded a storm of deduction. At last, as we turned into the square, he spoke. "Watson, have you ever observed how the greatest deceits depend upon the smallest of omissions? The Duchess of Ravenscourt, by all appearances, vanished from a locked room without disturbance. Yet something as trifling as a smudge of carriage grease betrays the entire performance." "You believe, then," I said, "that she was taken, not fled?" "I believe," said Holmes quietly, "that she was persuaded. And persuasion, Watson, is a far subtler crime than force. It is committed in whispers, not in shouts." The cab came to a halt before a handsome townhouse draped in ivy, with the brass knocker polished to a mirror's shine. Lady Whitcomb received us in a drawing-room of pale blue silk and silver gilt, her every movement delicate yet deliberate, as though her poise were a veil she never allowed to slip. She was a woman of perhaps 40, still handsome in a severe way, with eyes like polished jet and a voice low but resonant. "Mr. Holmes," she said, offering a gloved hand, "I have heard of your genius, though I confess I had hoped never to require it." "Nor do you, Lady Whitcomb," said Holmes with that bow of faint irony he reserved for women of high station. "We come merely to make inquiries concerning your friend, the Duchess of Ravenscourt." A flicker of genuine distress crossed her features. "You have news of her?" "None yet," said Holmes. "But I understand she was last in correspondence with you. We should be most obliged if you could tell us the nature of that communication." The lady hesitated, ever so slightly, but Holmes saw it at once. "She wrote to me 3 days ago," Lady Whitcomb said at last, moving to a writing desk and drawing out a sealed envelope. "It was an ordinary letter, or so I thought. I have not opened it. You see, Her Grace often sent me trifles, notes, invitations, verses, and I had no reason to suppose this one urgent." Holmes accepted the letter with grave courtesy. He examined the handwriting on the envelope, held it to the light, then turned it over. Sealed with wax bearing the Ravenscourt crest. No tampering, no duplication of hand. But the weight? Watson, feel that. Notice how the balance is irregular. Something small but dense enclosed. Perhaps a trinket or even a key. Lady Whitcomb clasped her hands. "Surely, Mr. Holmes, you mean to open it?" "Not yet," he replied, "for before we disturb the contents, I should like to know whether the Duchess mentioned anything to you verbally that might explain her state of mind." The widow's gaze shifted to the fire. She was troubled, yes. The Duke, though a man of stature, is not gentle. She confided that she felt watched, even within her own home. She spoke of a footstep she heard outside her window on more than one occasion. Holmes' eyes sharpened. A footstep outside her window? From the garden? So she believed. She thought it to be one of the servants, perhaps a guard. But she feared it was something else. A messenger, perhaps, from her past. Her tone wavered on that last phrase, and Holmes seized upon it. "Her past, Lady Whitcomb? You refer to her life before the Duke?" Lady Whitcomb hesitated once more. "I think you already suspect as much, Mr. Holmes. The Duchess was not always a duchess. Before her marriage, she was known as Miss Viola Trent, a lady of modest fortune but exquisite charm. There were suitors, one in particular, a certain Captain Allardyce, whose devotion bordered on obsession. He disappeared abroad after she married. I've always feared he would one day return." Holmes's expression betrayed neither surprise nor approval, only a deepening interest. "A soldier's patience," he murmured, "is a dangerous thing, my lady. They can wait years for a single moment." He took a penknife from his pocket and slit the letter open. From within, he drew a small silver key attached to a note written in a delicate hand. He read it silently, then passed it to me. It contained but a single line. If ever I am taken, find the place where the ivy hides the stone. V.T. Lady Whitcomb gasped softly. Taken? Then she knew? Holmes' eyes gleamed. Indeed, but the wording is peculiar. Taken. Not, should I disappear. She anticipated abduction as a certainty, not a possibility. He turned the key over in his fingers, studying the ornate handle engraved with a faint crest, an eagle clutching a rose. This key, Watson, is not from Ravenscourt House. The Duke's crest bears a lion rampant, not an eagle. Yet I have seen this emblem before, on the gates of a certain disused mews near Knightsbridge, once owned by Captain Allardyce himself. You believe he's involved? I asked. I believe, said Holmes, rising abruptly, that this key opens the next act of our little drama. Lady Whitcomb, I beg that you speak to no one of our visit. The Duchess trusted you enough to send this clue. Let us honor that trust by acting swiftly. She inclined her head gravely. You have my word, Mr. Holmes. God help her, wherever she is. As we left the house, Holmes's manner grew brisk, his eyes glittering with energy. Watson, he said as the cab pulled away, do you not see the beauty of it? A vanished duchess, a letter foretelling her capture, and a key to the one place her husband would never think to search, the home of her former lover. And yet, I ventured, what of the jewels? Surely Allardyce, if he has taken her, would have no use for them. Holmes smiled faintly. Ah, my dear friend, that is precisely why the jewels trouble me. A thief who steals love has no need for gold, unless the gold is meant to prove love's innocence. There is a riddle beneath the riddle, and we shall find it before the fog lifts. He tapped the silver key against his palm and leaned back, his expression one of serene satisfaction. For now, Watson, he said, we go to Knightsbridge, where ivy hides the stone. It was nearing noon when our cab turned from the main thoroughfare into a narrow lane behind Knightsbridge, where the fog still hung low despite the rising sun. The buildings here were of an older sort, stables converted into lodgings, their brickwork dulled by soot and neglect. Holmes leaned forward, his sharp eyes scanning each facade until his hand shot up suddenly. There, he said, pointing toward a set of tall wrought iron gates almost swallowed by a thick curtain of ivy. Note, Watson, the eagle crest upon the top rail, Captain Allardyce's mark, unmistakable. Where the ivy hides the stone? Indeed. The property beyond was silent, its windows shuttered and lifeless. The padlock on the gate was thick with rust. Holmes produced his slender case of tools and within moments had it open without a sound. You have grown uncomfortably adept at that, Holmes, I remarked. Necessity, my dear Watson, he replied lightly. London's mysteries are not solved by knocking at the door and waiting to be received. We stepped into a small courtyard paved with broken cobblestones. To one side stood the remains of a carriage shed. To the other, a two-story building with ivy clinging to every wall. Holmes moved ahead silently, brushing the vines aside until his fingers found a patch of cold stone set apart from the rest. Smoother, newer. Ah, he murmured. Our Duchess chose her words with admirable precision. He examined the masonry closely, then pressed a hidden catch that released a small iron door no larger than a window pane. Within lay a keyhole of unusual design. Holmes fitted the silver key and turned it. A faint click echoed, and a narrow door set into the side of the building swung inward. A rush of musty air greeted us, thick with the odor of neglect. Watson, Holmes said softly, striking a match, you will observe that our missing Duchess was not without ingenuity. She left herself a breadcrumb trail, knowing she might one day be followed. We entered a dim corridor lined with cracked plaster. Dust lay thick upon the floor, disturbed only by a single set of footprints, small, feminine, and recent. They led toward a chamber at the back of the building. Holmes's lantern illuminated the faint shimmer of silk upon the floor, a torn fragment of a woman's gown. By Jove, I exclaimed, she's been here. Indeed, Holmes murmured. and not long ago. The dust along this edge has been brushed aside within the last 24 hours. Look, Watson, the mark of a heel in the soot, and there, on the wall, a handprint, faint but distinct. The Duchess of Ravenscourt, alive when she reached this place. But what followed? We shall soon know. The chamber itself was sparsely furnished. A table, 2 chairs, a lamp, and an empty trunk. Yet even in such barrenness, Holmes found a symphony of evidence. He examined the lamp first, then the table, where a cup of tea, long since cold, stood upon a saucer. He touched it lightly. No dust upon the rim, he noted. This was used yesterday, perhaps last night. Someone was keeping her here, or meeting her here. He crossed to the trunk and opened it. Inside lay a man's greatcoat, military cut, adorned with brass buttons and bearing faint initials on the collar. C.A. "Captain Allardyce," I whispered. Holmes said nothing, but his eyes burned with that strange light I had come to fear almost as much as admire. He drew a folded paper from the pocket of the coat and unfolded it. "Dearest V, you must be patient. The arrangements are nearly complete. Once the funds are secured, we shall leave England for good. The Duke suspects nothing. Yours, always, C.A." Holmes read the note twice, then folded it carefully. "So," he said, "we have confirmation. The Duchess and the captain were in correspondence, perhaps even in collusion. The question is, were they lovers conspiring to flee or victim and deceiver playing at a crueler game?" I felt a chill despite the closed air. "And the jewels, Holmes, were they to fund their escape?" "Perhaps," he said quietly. "Or perhaps she was convinced to bring them under false pretenses. Remember, Watson, the captain vanished abroad years ago. Such men do not return without purpose, to rekindle old affection or to settle old debts." He moved toward the rear window, brushing away dust from the sill. There were marks there, too, deep indentations in the wood, as though a rope or cord had been tied. Holmes crouched, studying them through his glass. "A descent," he muttered. "Recent, and the rope frayed. Whoever left by this window did so in haste, and not alone." A soft rustle echoed through the empty corridor behind us. Instinctively, my hand went to my revolver. Holmes raised a finger for silence. We listened. Another sound, faint but distinct, the creak of a floorboard. Holmes extinguished the lantern, and we stood in utter darkness. Then, with feline suddenness, he flung the door wide and lunged forward. There was a scuffle, the crash of glass, and Holmes's voice, cool and triumphant. "Watson, the lamp, if you please." When I relit it, the flame illuminated a young man pinned against the wall by Holmes's arm. His face was thin, his coat threadbare, and his eyes wide with fear. "Who are you?" Holmes demanded. "Jenkins, sir," the man stammered. I was only watching the place for the captain. He pays me to keep it clean. Nothing more, I swear it." Holmes released him, but did not step back. "The Captain Allardyce, who met a lady here 2 nights ago?" Jenkins swallowed hard. "I don't know her name, sir. She came late, dressed fine with a veil. They talked a long time. Then he took her away in his carriage. Said he'd be back for his coat. That's all I know, I swear it." Holmes's eyes glinted. "Took her away, did he? And you've not seen him since?" "No, sir." Holmes nodded slowly. "You may go. But if I find you've spoken to anyone, particularly to the police, I shall know it before you take your next breath. Understood?" The man bolted like a frightened rabbit. Holmes turned to me, his expression grave. "Watson," he said softly, "we are now in the company of a ghost. Captain Allardyce, presumed dead these 5 years, has returned, not for love, but for vengeance. And our Duchess, poor lady, has walked willingly into his snare." He straightened his coat, pocketed the note, and strode toward the door. "The next move," he murmured, "belongs to the captain, but the endgame shall be mine." Come, Watson, let us pay a call to Scotland Yard. It is time Lestrade earned his salary. By the time we reached Scotland Yard, the gas lamps had been lit and a fine drizzle had begun to fall upon the cobbled streets. Lestrade met us in his office, his expression a curious mixture of impatience and skepticism. He looked up from a heap of papers as Holmes entered, removing his gloves with deliberate care. "Well, Mr. Holmes," said Lestrade, "you've been scarce since morning. The Duke is clamouring for news. Have you found his lady?" Holmes gave a thin smile. "We have found the ghost of her intentions, Inspector, which in this case may be more illuminating than the lady herself." Lestrade frowned. "You're speaking in riddles again." "Not riddles," Holmes corrected. "Only precision. The Duchess was neither abducted nor robbed. She left Ravenscourt House of her own volition, though under persuasion, and not for the reasons one might suppose." Lestrade raised his eyebrows. "Then she's eloped." Holmes turned toward me with a faint sigh, as though weary of the limitations of human understanding. "If only life were so simple, Watson. Tell the inspector what we discovered at Knightsbridge." I did so, recounting the hidden door, the key, the footprints, and the coat marked C.A. Holmes listened silently, pacing the floor in measured steps. When I finished, he stopped abruptly beside the window and looked out upon the rain-soaked street. "The Duchess met Captain Allardyce there," he said at last. "He promised her escape, perhaps even freedom from an unhappy marriage. Yet by the condition of that chamber, the tea untouched and the rope marks upon the window, I fear she did not leave of her own accord. He took her away, alive." Lestrade leaned back in his chair. "Then we're after a kidnapping. I'll have the river watched and the train stations covered by midnight." Holmes shook his head. "You may save yourself the trouble. A man such as Allardyce does not flee immediately. He waits. There is something unfinished, something he must accomplish before he departs England. Tell me, have there been any reports from the riverside this morning? Unidentified carriages, disturbances, or abandoned property?" Lestrade frowned and shuffled through his papers. "Now that you mention it, yes. A cabman reported finding a cloak and a woman's glove near Lambeth Pier, around dawn. Thought it might be robbery at first, but there was no body. We sent a constable. Found nothing more." Holmes's eyes lit with sudden fire. Lambeth Pier, the perfect place for secrecy, isolated, misty, and within reach of the old warehouses once used by Allardyce's regiment for munition storage. He turned sharply. "Come, Watson. Lestrade, send 2 men to follow in 10 minutes' time. We'll go ahead. If my suspicion proves correct, we may yet prevent a tragedy, or expose one long buried." The fog along the river was thick as wool, muffling sound and shape alike. The water slapped dully against the stone steps as Holmes and I made our way down the pier, lanterns casting ghostly circles of light. The damp air carried a faint odor of oil and tar. Holmes stooped suddenly, his keen eyes catching something half hidden beneath a pile of discarded rope. It was a lady's slipper, its silk darkened by mud. He lifted it delicately. "The companion to the glove," he murmured. "The Duchess was here, beyond all doubt." We pressed onward toward a derelict warehouse whose broken windows stared like hollow eyes. Holmes tried the door. It yielded with a groan. The interior was dim, the air close. As our lanterns flared, I saw boxes piled high along the walls, a few old crates marked with faded military insignia. Holmes raised his lantern toward the floor, and there, scrawled faintly in chalk, were 3 letters, VT. "She left her mark again," I whispered. Holmes crouched, examining the writing. "Fresh," he said, "within the last few hours." Her hand trembled. "See the irregular pressure?" She was frightened. A sudden sound echoed from deeper within, a metallic clang followed by a muffled cry. Holmes's head snapped up. Without a word, he motioned me forward, lantern lowered. We moved between the crates, silent as shadows, until we came upon a narrow passage. There, through a half-open door, I glimpsed movement. A tall man, his back turned, bending over a chair to which a woman was bound. Her fair hair glimmered faintly in the light. Holmes's eyes met mine, and in that instant he sprang forward with the swiftness of a striking hawk. "Stand where you are, Captain Allardyce." The man spun round, his face pale and drawn, but unmistakably that of a soldier. His hand went to his breast pocket. Before he could draw the revolver there concealed, Holmes had seized his wrist and twisted it sharply. The weapon clattered to the ground. "By heaven, Holmes!" I cried, rushing forward to cut the cords around the woman's hands. It was indeed the Duchess, pale, conscious, and trembling. Allardyce glared at Holmes with wild, feverish eyes. "You don't understand," he gasped. "She came to me willingly. I loved her once. I would have saved her from that cold-hearted tyrant she calls husband." "By imprisoning her," Holmes said coldly. "By luring her under false promises and binding her like contraband." The captain's voice broke. "She was leaving with me. She said she would come, but when the hour came she changed her mind. She feared the scandal. I only meant to keep her here until she saw reason." Holmes studied him for a long moment, then spoke quietly. "And the jewels?" Allardyce hesitated. "Collateral. The Duke owes me a debt, money he promised years ago for my silence. She was to bring them to settle it." The Duchess, her voice weak but clear, whispered, "He lies, Mr. Holmes. I came only to return what was never mine, to end a past that haunted me. When I refused to go with him, he lost all reason." Holmes looked from one to the other, then sighed. "Two truths tangled in one net. Love and pride make poor allies, my dear Captain. Lestrade will sort the rest." And as if on cue, footsteps thundered up from the pier. Lestrade burst into the warehouse with 2 constables in tow. Holmes stepped aside. "You will find your quarry ready, Inspector." As Allardyce was led away, he turned once toward the Duchess. "Viola," he said softly, "I would have given you the world." Her eyes glistened, but she said nothing. Holmes, ever courteous, helped her to her feet. "Your Grace, I believe you owe me a cab fare, and my friend here a quiet evening at home." For the first time that day she smiled faintly. "You shall have both, Mr. Holmes." Outside, the fog had begun to thin. Holmes stood for a long moment watching the river flow past. "Watson," he said quietly, "there are cases which begin as crimes and end as tragedies. This, I think, was one." The following morning dawned pale and brittle, a November sun filtering weakly through the London mist. Holmes sat opposite me at breakfast in our rooms at Baker Street, a cigarette smouldering between his fingers and the morning paper spread open upon his knee. He had scarcely touched his tea. His gaze was fixed on the column marked "Society and the Law." "The affair of the Stolen Duchess has reached the press," he remarked, tapping the headline with one long, lean finger. "It appears the Gazette is already hailing the return of Her Grace as a triumph for Scotland Yard. Lestrade's name, of course, is in bold type." I smiled faintly. "You don't begrudge him the credit, Holmes?" "My dear Watson," he replied, "I have long since relinquished the desire for public acclaim. But what does concern me is the note of finality in this article. The case is far from concluded." I set down my cup. "You believe there is more to it?" Holmes's expression hardened. "I believe we have seen only the surface of a much darker design." Before I could speak further, Mrs. Hudson appeared at the door bearing a small envelope. "Delivered by hand, not 10 minutes ago, sir," she said. "For you, Mr. Holmes." He took it and turned it over thoughtfully. "Ah, Ravenscourt crest, as I suspected." He broke the seal and read the contents aloud. "Mr. Holmes, my wife has returned, yet the matter is not ended. I request your presence at once. Certain discoveries compel me to reopen this unfortunate business. Yours, Ravenscourt." Holmes's eyes gleamed with renewed intensity. So, the Duke re-enters the stage. Watson, your hat. There is more smoke in this fire than the public has been allowed to see. When we arrived at Ravenscourt House, the mood within was markedly altered. The servants moved with the uneasy silence of those who sense danger but dare not name it. The Duke awaited us in his study, a tall, gaunt man whose face seemed to have aged 10 years overnight. He rose stiffly as we entered. "Mr. Holmes, you were instrumental in recovering my wife. For that I am obliged, but I fear the matter is not as simple as it appears." Holmes inclined his head. "Pray, explain, Your Grace." The Duke gestured toward the desk. Upon it lay a velvet-lined box, open and empty. "The Ravenscourt jewels," he said grimly. "When my wife was found, the case was still missing. This morning it was returned, placed upon that very desk before dawn." I glanced at Holmes, who had gone very still. "Returned? By whom?" "That is the question," the Duke said, his voice low. "My servants swear they saw no one, yet this note was enclosed within." He handed it to Holmes. The handwriting was unfamiliar, neat, deliberate. "A debt repaid, a bargain complete. Keep your silence, and your honor remains intact." Holmes studied the paper closely, then looked up sharply. "You recognize this hand, of course?" The Duke hesitated. "No, though I have my suspicions." "Then allow me to relieve you of them," said Holmes coolly. "This hand is not Allardyce's. It is a woman's." The Duke's eyes flickered. "You imply—" "I imply nothing, Your Grace. I merely observe. The curvature of the script, the angle of the loops, all feminine. The Duchess, I presume, has not been entirely forthcoming with you." The Duke's composure faltered for a moment, revealing a glimmer of raw emotion, anger, perhaps, or fear. "You must understand, Mr. Holmes. My wife's conduct has long been a source of humiliation. I married her out of affection, but she never quite shed the ghosts of her youth." Holmes's voice softened, though his eyes remained sharp. "And you kept her under watch, did you not? The footstep she heard beneath her window, was it not your own manservant?" The Duke's jaw tightened. "I sought only to protect my name. Society is a merciless judge." Holmes nodded slowly. "Indeed it is. Yet it judges more harshly those who think themselves beyond reproach." He turned abruptly toward the window, gazing out over the foggy garden. "You were aware of Allardyce's return before this incident began. You allowed him to draw near, to re-establish contact with the Duchess. Why?" The Duke's silence was answer enough. Holmes faced him squarely. "Because you wished it. You allowed the correspondence to continue, hoping that his passion would compromise her reputation, thus providing you grounds for annulment, or something more convenient." The Duke's face went pale. "You overstep, sir." Holmes's voice was low and icy. "Do I? You arranged the watch upon her, the rumors of her distress, even the jewels left conspicuously displayed. You created the stage upon which Allardyce could act, knowing that his desperation would drive him to folly. And when he took the bait, you waited, ready to expose him, destroy her name, and emerge unblemished." The Duke's hand trembled upon the desk. "You have no proof?" Holmes withdrew from his pocket a small square of parchment. "On the contrary, when the Duchess was found, her wrists still bore the marks of binding, but only upon one side. The other was loosened. Why? Because she freed herself long before we arrived. She had been waiting for me. This scrap found beneath her chair confirms it." He placed the fragment upon the table. In faint pencil were the words, "He was not alone." The Duke stared at it in silence. Holmes continued softly, "Allardyce believed himself master of the game, but he was merely a pawn. Someone informed him of her unhappiness, of the jewels, of the time she would be alone. Who could have known all that but her husband? And yet, Your Grace, I do not think you meant for the matter to go so far. You wished scandal, not blood." The Duke sank into his chair, his composure crumbling. "I wanted only to be free of her," he murmured. "Her beauty, her defiance. It mocked me. I never thought he would harm her." Holmes regarded him coolly. "You thought to control a man once trained to kill. You played at chess with human lives, and now you find yourself in check." He turned toward the door. "Lestrade will have what he needs. I shall say nothing of your involvement, provided the Duchess is left in peace. One more shadow, and I will bring daylight upon Ravenscourt House." The Duke did not answer. He merely stared at the empty jewel box, his lips moving silently, perhaps in prayer, perhaps in regret. Outside, as we descended the steps, I ventured, "Holmes, will you truly spare him?" Holmes's face was unreadable. "Watson, justice is a many-faced creature. The law may bind the hand, but guilt binds the soul far more tightly. I have no doubt the Duke will punish himself, far more thoroughly than any court could." He drew his coat tighter against the chill. "Come, my dear friend. This case smells of too much pride and too little love. I should prefer the clean simplicity of a good murder next time." And with that dry remark, he hailed a cab, disappearing once more into the London fog that seemed forever to follow him. It was a cold, wind-bitten afternoon when a discreet note arrived at Baker Street, written in an elegant hand upon thick ivory paper. "Mr. Holmes, I beg one final interview before I leave England. I have much to say that was not said before. V.R." Holmes read it twice, silently. Then, folding it carefully, he said, "Watson, the Duchess of Ravenscourt requests our company. I rather imagine her letter will close the final page of this unhappy chapter." We set out just past 3 o'clock, the November sky low and metallic above the hansom cab. The Duchess had taken residence not at Ravenscourt House, but at a small private hotel in Kensington Gardens, far from the gaze of society. When we were shown into her sitting room, I scarcely recognized her. Gone was the splendid attire, the jewels, the aristocratic hauteur. She wore a simple dark gown, her hair drawn back without ornament. Yet there was a calm dignity about her that neither scandal nor sorrow had been able to erase. "Mr. Holmes," she said softly, extending her hand, "you must think me a most ungrateful woman for summoning you again after all you have done. But there are truths, you see, that cannot remain buried. Not if one hopes to breathe freely again." Holmes bowed slightly. "Truth, Your Grace, is a fragile thing. It can bruise easily when handled by the world. I advise caution." She gave a faint, wistful smile. "I no longer require caution, Mr. Holmes. Only peace." She motioned for us to sit, and after a long pause, began her tale in that low, steady voice which lent every word a kind of haunting music. "When I married the Duke," she said, "I did so not for love, but for salvation. My father's debts were ruinous. The Duke offered honor, security, and his name. I believed affection might follow, as it does in novels. It never did. He was not a cruel man, not in the common sense. But he believed affection a weakness. I was to be his ornament, nothing more. When I smiled, it was to please him. When I wept, he called it vanity. And yet," she continued, "I could have endured it, had I not discovered that my past was being used against me." Holmes inclined his head. "By Captain Allardyce?" "Yes, though not at first. It was the Duke who reminded me of him. He would drop his name in conversation, feign concern, and watch my reaction. I came to learn that he had intercepted my letters. Letters written years before, innocent in feeling yet dangerous in implication. He meant to use them should I ever defy him. Then, one morning, a message reached me. It bore the captain's hand, or so I thought, imploring me to meet him privately, to recover those same letters before the Duke exposed them. I hesitated for days, but when another note came, warning that the Duke planned to act within the week, I yielded. You know the rest. Holmes was silent for several moments. You mean to say, he asked quietly, that the first letter came not from Allardyce, but from your husband? She met his gaze squarely. Yes. He meant me to go to the captain, to be found there by his men, disgraced beyond redemption. The captain was to be bait, nothing more. But what the Duke did not foresee was that Allardyce, once lured, would seize the opportunity to act upon his own passions. The trap ensnared us both. Her voice trembled slightly, then steadied again. When I realized the Duke's design, I tried to warn Allardyce, to end it. He grew desperate, furious. He accused me of using him as the Duke had. In that madness, he took me by force. The rest you know. I exchanged a glance with Holmes, who sat motionless, fingers steepled beneath his chin. You might have told the police, he said at last. I could not, she replied simply. The scandal would have destroyed what little honor remained to my family's name, and though I loathe what the Duke has done, he is still my husband. I could not see him publicly ruined. Holmes regarded her thoughtfully. And the jewels? Her lips curved in a sad half-smile. They were mine by law, yet his by pride. When I learned that he meant to frame me as a thief as well as an adulteress, I took them first. They became my ransom, my proof of innocence. When the affair ended, I returned them. I wished only to leave England unburdened. Holmes rose slowly and walked to the window, his silhouette framed by the grey light beyond. The Duke believes the jewels returned to be Allardyce's doing, he said. I know, she answered. It is better so. There was a long silence. Then she said almost to herself, Do you think, Mr. Holmes, that truth ever redeems? Or does it merely expose the scars one has tried to hide? Holmes turned toward her, his expression unusually gentle. Truth, madam, is neither balm nor blade. It is light, and light, once admitted, can never again be banished. Tears glistened briefly in her eyes, but she smiled through them. Then I thank you for bringing light to mine. She rose and extended her hand. Holmes bowed over it with rare solemnity. One last question, Your Grace, he said. Will you remain in England? No, she replied. There is a convent in the south of France. Quiet, anonymous. It will receive me without judgment. I've known too much of society's justice. I wish now to learn heaven's. Holmes inclined his head. Then may peace attend you there. As we left the hotel, the evening fog was beginning to roll once more across the gardens. Holmes walked in silence for a long while before speaking. There is a peculiar mercy in exile, Watson, he said at last. The world may call her disgraced, but I think she's the only innocent among them. You believe she spoke truthfully? Entirely, he said. Her story fits every shadow we have observed. The Duke's machinations, Allardyce's desperation, all threads of one cruel tapestry woven by pride and vanity. We walked on through the fading light, the bells of St. Mary Abbott's tolling faintly in the distance. Holmes drew his collar up against the chill and murmured, Love, Watson, is the most dangerous crime of all. It leaves evidence that reason can never erase. And with that, he hailed a cab, vanishing once again into the fog. His mind, I knew, already turning from tragedy to the next enigma awaiting his incomparable intellect. 2 days passed after our meeting with the Duchess, and in that time Sherlock Holmes maintained a silence so deep and impenetrable that I feared his mind had turned inward upon itself. He neither spoke of the case nor took another, but sat for hours by the fire, motionless save for the thin spiral of smoke rising from his cigarette. The morning of the third day brought with it a curious interruption. As I was reading the Times, a heavy envelope bearing the seal of Ravenscourt House was delivered. I placed it on the table beside Holmes, who regarded it without moving for several seconds. then reached for it with the air of a man who has been expecting its arrival. He slit the envelope and drew out several folded pages, aged parchment faintly scented with wax. "Ah," he murmured, "the last move has been played." "What is it?" I asked. Holmes handed me the top sheet. It was a brief letter written in a firm, deliberate hand. The Duke's. "Mr. Holmes, I am leaving England. My affairs, both public and private, have reached their natural conclusion. The jewels have been returned, and I have no further claim upon my wife. What remains between us will be settled in eternity. You once said justice binds the soul more tightly than the law. I now understand your meaning. Yours, Ravenscourt." Holmes leaned back, eyes half closed. "A suicide note, though politely phrased," he said. "Good heavens, Holmes, surely not." He gestured toward the remaining papers. "Read on, my dear Watson. You will find the proof." The second document was a will, signed, sealed, witnessed. It transferred the entire Ravenscourt estate, with the exception of a modest annuity for the servants, to one Viola Ravenscourt, formerly Duchess, now known to be residing abroad. The final sheet was the most extraordinary, a bundle of letters, copies evidently in the Duke's own hand. Each was addressed to Captain Allardyce, dated over the months preceding the Duchess's disappearance. "You will find the lady easily deceived by appeals to sentiment. She has long cherished your memory. I require only that she be persuaded to meet you and that she bring with her the jewels. Your reward will be sufficient." Another followed. "I caution you to make no harm upon her person. The appearance of scandal is all that is needed. My man will be in place to ensure no lasting damage." The last bore a single line. "It is done. She will come tonight. Afterwards, you will disappear. The rest I shall manage." When I had finished reading, I sat back in stunned silence. "Then you were right from the beginning, Holmes. The Duke orchestrated the entire affair." Holmes nodded gravely. "Yes, but like many who fancy themselves master strategists, he failed to account for the unpredictable variable of human emotion. He treated passion as a mechanism to be manipulated, not as the uncontrollable force it is. When Allardyce's obsession overpowered his reason, the Duke's design turned inward upon himself." He rose and crossed to the window, gazing into the grey, drizzling street below. "Do you not see, Watson? The Duchess's disappearance, the jewels, the scandal, it was all meant to end in humiliation, not tragedy. The Duke never imagined blood would be shed. When it was, and when I laid bare his complicity, the weight of his own machinations crushed him." I asked quietly, "Has his death been confirmed?" Holmes nodded toward the paper I had been reading earlier. "Turn to page 6. There, in the column of obituaries, stood a simple line. The Duke of Ravenscourt, of Belgrave Square, passed away suddenly at his residence. Cause undisclosed." I set the paper down. "So it ends, then. All 3 players gone from the stage. The Duke dead, the captain imprisoned, and the Duchess vanished into exile." "Gone," said Holmes softly, "but not forgotten. They have each left behind the trace of their folly, letters, lies, and the faint odor of tragedy that lingers even after the curtain falls." He turned to me, his expression unreadable. "You recall, Watson, that the Duchess asked whether truth redeems or merely exposes. I might now answer her, truth redeems no one, but it frees the innocent from the chains of deceit." I regarded him closely. "You speak as though the Duchess were blameless." "In this," he replied, "she was the least guilty. She loved unwisely, endured unjustly, and was used by both men as the means to their own vanity. Yet she alone had the courage to confess. That, Watson, is redemption enough." He walked to the mantel and placed the Duke's letter upon the fire. The paper curled and blackened, the wax seal melting into a crimson drop. "Let the world believe what it will," he said quietly. The law has had its satisfaction, society its scandal. But the truth, the truth belongs only to those who can bear it. As the flames consumed the last of the parchment, I ventured, "And what will you do with the remaining letters?" "I shall return them," Holmes said simply. "To France, to the convent at Montpellier, where the Duchess now resides. There are wounds that only silence can heal, and she deserves the peace her husband's shadow denied her." He placed the remaining pages into an envelope and sealed it with wax. As he wrote the address, his hand was steady, his face calm. "Strange, is it not?" he murmured. "How often those who claim to guard honor are undone by it, while those condemned as fallen rise higher in the end." He looked up then, his sharp grey eyes softening as they met mine. "Come, Watson, you have that look of melancholy sentimentality that so often follows my more tragic cases. Let us take a walk. The air outside is bitter, but it will clear the head." And so we stepped out into the narrow street, the wind biting through our coats. Holmes drew his scarf close and added, almost to himself, "The game is over, but the board remains, and somewhere another hand is already arranging the next move." The fog swallowed his words, and for a long time we walked in silence. It was late on the evening following the Duke's death when I found Sherlock Holmes once again before the fire at 221B Baker Street, the faint blue glow of his cigarette ember flickering in rhythm with his thoughts. Outside, the rain tapped ceaselessly at the windows, and London lay in that peculiar hush that follows the fall of scandal. A city holding its breath, eager for new gossip to replace the old. Chamartsur had spoken little since we returned from Ravenscourt House, and even less since the morning's news of the Duke's demise. He had refused dinner, consumed nothing but black coffee, and stared for hours at the empty grate. I had learned that such silences were not to be broken lightly. Yet that night, as the clock struck 10, he stirred suddenly and said in a voice low and deliberate, "Watson, I have been a fool." I looked up, startled. "A fool, Holmes? Surely not after the manner in which this case has concluded?" He gave a thin, mirthless smile. "Ah, but it has not concluded. You see, my dear friend, there is still one piece missing, a single inconsistency which, like a grain of sand in the mechanism of a watch, stops the whole from running true." He rose, crossed to his desk, and from a drawer drew forth a small envelope, worn at the edges, sealed with the faint impression of a convent's crest. "This arrived by the morning post," he said, "from France." I leaned forward as he opened it. Inside was a short note, written in the same elegant hand I'd last seen in Kensington Gardens. "Mr. Holmes, I've prayed for the soul of the Duke, though I cannot forgive him. You said truth is light. You were right, but light can blind as well as reveal. Do not seek me again. My name is no longer Viola Ravenscourt, Sister Imelda." He passed it to me without comment. "She's taken the veil," I murmured. "Surely that is an ending." Holmes shook his head. "An ending, yes, but not the truth. Tell me, Watson, do you recall the note we found in the Duke's study, written in a woman's hand? A debt repaid, a bargain complete." "Of course. You said it was the Duchess's handwriting." "I did," said Holmes softly. "And I was correct, but the question that has haunted me since is, what bargain?" He began to pace the room, his movements quick and restless. "Consider. The Duchess returned the jewels to her husband before dawn, and yet she had already booked passage for France. She could easily have fled with them, securing both freedom and fortune. Instead, she sent them back, along with that cryptic note. Why? What debt was being settled? I ventured, perhaps guilt, Holmes. She wished to make amends for the deception, to cleanse herself before leaving England." "Guilt?" Holmes repeated, stopping short. "No, Watson, there is no guilt in her final words, only purpose. She spoke of debt, not remorse. She owed something, and she paid it. But to whom?" He turned suddenly toward the cabinet and withdrew the surviving correspondence. the Duke's letters to Allardyce. Laying them out in order, he pointed to the final line. "It is done. She will come tonight. Afterwards, you will disappear." "Do you not see it?" he said. "The Duke intended Allardyce to vanish, yet he wrote you will disappear. Not you must. A curious choice of words. One implying not command, but certainty. It suggests he knew the captain would vanish of his own accord, not through flight, but through death." "Good heavens," I said. "You think the Duke meant for him to be killed?" "Not by his own hand," said Holmes grimly. "By hers." He let that word hang in the air, watching me as the meaning settled. "You mean the Duchess?" I stammered. "But she was his victim." "Was she?" Holmes's voice dropped almost to a whisper. "Or was she the last player in the game, the one who ended it on her own terms?" He took up another paper, this one the constable's report from Lambeth Pier. "Read here. When we found her, she bore no bruises consistent with a struggle save for the rope marks upon her wrists. And yet Allardyce's weapon, his revolver, was found empty. One shot fired. No wound upon his person, yet his pulse barely present when arrested. You think she fired? I think she did more than that. I think she planned it." He moved to the window, his silhouette stark against the lamplight. "She discovered her husband's plot. She knew Allardyce had been enlisted to ruin her, that he might in his desperation obey any order the Duke gave. So she turned the snare upon both of them. She went to the meeting armed, not to elope, but to confront him. A struggle followed. She fired, grazing him, stunning him long enough to flee. When we arrived, she allowed us to believe she was his prisoner. It was her final act of protection, for herself, and perhaps even for him." I was silent for a long time. "But why conceal it, Holmes? Why let the world think her a victim?" "Because, Watson," he said gently, "she understood that the truth, once revealed, would destroy not only herself, but the fragile remnants of decency surrounding the name she bore. She chose instead to carry her sin in silence. That is the meaning of her last letter. A debt repaid. She owed the Duke retribution for his cruelty, owed Allardyce pity for his madness, and owed herself the peace of confession. She paid all three, and vanished." He turned from the window then, his face softened by something I rarely saw in him, compassion. "It is a rare case indeed, my friend, when justice and mercy meet halfway. I cannot condemn her. She did what necessity demanded, and then she absolved herself the only way she could." I sat back, struck by the gravity of his words. "Then all your deductions, all your logic, have led to this, an unsolved crime that must remain unsolved." Holmes smiled faintly. "My dear Watson, not unsolved. Simply unspoken." He gathered the letters once more and sealed them in a small envelope. "These shall remain here," he said, placing them within the drawer of his desk. "Some day, perhaps, history will be kinder than the present. Until then, let silence serve as her judge." He sank once more into his chair, the firelight flickering across his thoughtful face. "There is one consolation," he added quietly. "The Duchess of Ravenscourt, Sister Imelda, as she now calls herself, has at last escaped every prison built for her, marriage, scandal, and even the reach of justice." The rain continued its steady rhythm against the window, soft and ceaseless. Holmes reached for his violin, drew the bow across the strings, and a single, haunting note filled the room. Low, mournful, and strangely pure. It seemed to me, as I sat there listening, that the music was not for the Duke, nor for the captain, but for the woman who had outwitted them both, and paid the highest price for her freedom. It was several weeks after the affair of the Stolen Duchess had drawn to its melancholy close that I found myself once again seated by the fire at 221B Baker Street, the familiar comforts of our lodgings restored to their tranquil order. Outside, the December wind moaned through the chimneys, carrying with it the scent of coal smoke and rain. Within, the fire burned low and steady, casting a faint golden glow upon Holmes's lean, ascetic features as he lounged in his armchair, his violin resting idle upon his knee. Since the conclusion of the case, he had spoken of it but once, and then only in passing, remarking that a lie told for mercy's sake is the rarest form of truth. Beyond that cryptic observation, he had maintained a silence so profound that even I, who had long since learned the rhythms of his moods, could not tell whether the affair had wearied him or merely satisfied that inscrutable hunger for understanding which governed his existence. It was I who broke the quiet that evening. "Holmes," I said, closing the book I had been reading, "I've been thinking of the Duchess." He made no movement save to shift his gaze slightly toward me. "Indeed, Watson, a subject not easily dismissed, I confess." "She has taken the veil," I continued. "Yet I cannot help but wonder whether she has found peace, or merely another form of imprisonment." Holmes's lips curved faintly. "Peace, my dear fellow, is seldom found by those who seek it deliberately. More often, it finds those who have ceased to desire anything at all." I shook my head. "You speak as if she were beyond redemption." "Not beyond it," he replied, "merely indifferent to it. The Duchess has paid her moral debts in full, though the ledger of society will never be balanced. In that convent in France, she will wear her silence as others wear jewels. It is her penance and her refuge." For a moment, the only sound was the ticking of the clock upon the mantel. Then Holmes leaned forward, his eyes gleaming in the firelight. "You see, Watson," he said quietly, "there was never truly a crime in this affair, not as the law would define it. There was only the clash of human vanities, each seeking to master the other. The Duke's pride, the captain's passion, the Duchess's longing for freedom, all threads woven into one fabric of tragedy. And in the end, it was not guilt that destroyed them, but the illusion that any of them could control what love makes of us." I regarded him thoughtfully. "And yet, Holmes, you exposed them all. You laid bare the truth. Does that not trouble you, knowing how near she came to destruction because of it?" He gave a faint smile, sad and yet serene. "Truth, my dear Watson, is never merciful, though I sometimes wish it were. It is my business to reveal, not to console. But if, in doing so, I have driven one soul toward peace and another toward repentance, then perhaps even the harshest light serves a purpose." He rose then and began to pace slowly before the hearth, his hands clasped behind his back. I have thought often of that night at the warehouse. The Duchess bound to the chair, her face pale in the lantern glow, her eyes meeting mine without fear. There was no helplessness in her gaze, Watson, only resignation, as though she knew that rescue, when it came, would change nothing. "You believe she anticipated it all?" I asked softly. He nodded. "Every step. She walked into her husband's trap knowing it might destroy her, but in doing so, she destroyed his design instead. The Duke thought himself the puppeteer. She cut the strings. That, I think, was her final act of defiance." Holmes stopped before the window and drew the curtain aside. The fog had begun to drift once more through Baker Street, curling around the gas lamps like ghosts. "Look there, Watson. London never changes. Its fogs, its crimes, its hearts hidden behind drawn curtains. And yet within each fog bank lies another story waiting to unfold." I smiled faintly. "And another case for you to solve." He let the curtain fall. "Perhaps, but not tonight. Tonight I am content to let the world remain unsolved for a few hours more." He returned to his chair, lighting his pipe. "You will write this case, I suppose?" "I have already begun," I admitted, "though I wonder whether it ought ever to be published. The tale is too human, perhaps, to be judged by readers who expect only deduction and crime." Holmes chuckled softly, the smoke curling upward. "You fear for my reputation?" "For hers," I said quietly. He regarded me with a look of rare gentleness. "Then omit her name, my friend. Let her remain a figure in shadow, a duchess no longer stolen, but set free. Say only that she vanished into the mists of France, leaving behind the memory of a beauty too proud for pity and too honest for deceit. He paused, then added almost wistfully, and perhaps mentioned that for once Sherlock Holmes found a mystery he chose not to solve aloud. We sat for some time in companionable silence, the fire crackling softly between us. Outside, a cab rattled past, its wheels muffled by the fog. The city's pulse went on, indifferent to the small tragedies enacted beneath its endless veil. At last, Holmes spoke again, very softly as though to himself. "Do you recall what I told you once, Watson? That when you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth?" "Indeed," he smiled faintly. "In this case, I have learned there is one further category, the unspeakable, that which must remain forever between the lines." He leaned back, closing his eyes, the faintest trace of weariness in his features. "The law may bind men's bodies, but silence, silence binds their souls. Remember that when you write it." The fire burned low. The clock struck 11. I rose quietly, leaving him to his thoughts, and as I closed my notebook, I wrote the final line that would end my account. Thus concluded the case of the Stolen Duchess, a tale of love, pride, and silence, in which Holmes uncovered every truth save one, the secret that a woman carries when the world has taken all else from her. I looked once more at Holmes, who sat motionless, the firelight reflecting in his sharp grey eyes like twin embers of restless thought. Outside, the fog thickened, swallowing London whole, and so ended the case of the Stolen Duchess, not with triumph, but with quiet understanding, and with Holmes, as ever, alone with the mystery that no deduction could dispel, the mystery of the human heart.